We're moving seamlessly into this next session and then following session with Jane Hurd before lunch. And I hope it will be seamless in the sense that I think there are some continuities between what I hope to be saying to you, what Andrew has already said, and I think where Jane will follow on. But I wanted to thank, first of all, the University of Essex and the Central Cyclical Practice for inviting me to speak with you today. And it is fantastic to see such a room full of people, given we know what a difficult climate it is. So it's great that you have either fought, begged, pleaded, or been given the money to come today, because it's really encouraging to see so many people. And it also feels to me a bit like coming home, because I used to work in Essex many years ago, and one of the cases I had was a young woman with a baby who actually came to bed and breakfast in Southend. So I remember coming and visiting her here, and I have to say, dreading it. She was a mother who'd had several children already, and they'd all been removed from her. And this was probably, I can't exactly remember, perhaps her third or fourth baby. And I remember knowing that I was coming to see her in bed and breakfast accommodation. I didn't know who would be there. I knew she had a new partner. I didn't know whether he would be there. And I can still remember the feelings that were evoked as I was driving down and wondering what I was coming to. And so I think it's important to say that, perhaps, because I think one of the criticisms that as academics we often have put at our door is that we're out of touch with practice if we're not currently practicing. And I strongly refute that, actually, for a number of reasons, which I won't go into now. I'm happy to have conversations with people about it. But I wanted to just make that connection with you all, in that I think our experiences of practice, particularly when they're rooted in relationships, stay with us and can inform our thinking, even perhaps when we're not engaged in direct practice now. The other little funny story that came off this experience was, at that point in time, and this is how long ago it was, we used to handwrite our notes from visits, and then we would go to the typing pool. So I handwrote my notes, gave them to the typing pool to type up, and it came back, and I was reading it, and it said, and I visited the mother, and the baby was on the bed on pillars. I think it should be pillows, but I had this image of this baby sort of in a rather kind of Greek pose lying on these pillars, which goes to show how bad my handwriting is. But that's also how long ago it was. What I'm wanting to think about in connection with that, building on this notion of relationships, is where are we in relation to relationship-based practice now, in what is being termed, I think, this post-Monroe era. We've had the Monroe report, so where are we now? What's going on? What's it all about? So that's what I want to think about with you. And I think some of it is also about where I am in time too. And it's been very interesting just having two conversations with people. A woman over here who just said at the end of Andrew's talk, you know, I've been around long enough to see that this is the wheel turning again. Here we are, we're back in this position of thinking about relationship-based practice. And any of you in the room who've got hair the colour of me will feel something similar, that there is some kind of resonance of things that have been around previously. And somebody else said exactly the same. It feels like we're going full circle. But I want to suggest, I think, that I don't think we're actually going full circle, but I think we're kind of, the wheel is turning and the wheel has moved on. So there is nothing new under the sun. I don't think we're in entirely new terrain, but you can never step in the same river twice. So something's moved, something has changed, and what is it? And why might we feel that we can have some enthusiasm and some excitement about what the future holds, but also some realism in there too about it's not altogether easy. And lovely lyric in a song by Paul Simon, but whenever it comes on, it always gets me thinking, because I never know whether I understand it or not, but I won't sing it to you. Everything is different, but nothing has changed. And I never know if I've got the words right, and whether it's nothing is different, everything has changed. In one sense, it doesn't entirely matter. But if there is something about that, something paradoxical, that can perhaps keep our curiosity with this whole area of change. And I was thinking about that in relation, if there's nothing new, how can we keep these continuities going? And many of you will know the work of Olive Stevenson, who is an eminent professor of social work, has been retired for several years, but kept up until recently very active in the field of social work, contributing to debates at high levels, influencing policy thinking. And Olive has a website where she's done quite a lot of work thinking about her own experience across the years in relation to the social work profession and how it's changed and what's gone on. And this is just an excerpt from it. And I'm going to read it because I think it's important we hear these things and digest them. When I trained as a social worker in 1953, hopes were high for the emergence of a profession which would make a significant contribution to the well-being of children in need. Subsequently, such aspirations were extended more widely to include the well-being of many kinds of people in difficulty. For a number of reasons which I've charted in my writings, this optimism has been dimmed over the past 50 years. I believe that there is an urgent need to recapture the vision and the ethical basis for social work. Without those, we are lost in tangles of bureaucracy and in anxious and despairing feelings about the tasks which must be undertaken. Social work is extremely complicated work. I believe that those who practice research or teach it can only do so effectively if they seek to understand and utilise the interplay of mind and feelings in themselves and others. So I think already you will see the clear continuities of what Andrew was saying first thing this morning, about this need for us to attend to what's going on in our internal worlds, in our thoughts and in our feelings, and holding them together. And that's something that has been around since, I think, the beginning of social work back in the sort of 1930s and 40s, with the predecessors of Olive Stevenson, people like Claire Winnicott, who were a very important influence on her. This work is still pertinent to the climate we're in, but it's also got to be engaging with slightly different agendas that we face. But in one sense, I'm saying we shouldn't be despondent that we still don't feel we've sorted it out, because we've been sorting out for a long time, and we won't sort it out today. But we can all make small contributions to improving the professional status of social work and improving our own experience of the work that we do. And what I'm suggesting is that we are, there've been in the past sort of 10 years, 3 phases, I suppose, since 2002, as a neat kind of way of trying to think about what's been going on recently and how we got here. And this I've talked about as the post-Climbier Every Child Matters era and the birth of electronic children. So for many of you this will be quite familiar, you would have lived and worked through this period. For those of you more recently into the profession, it might be something you're aware of but didn't live through. Or work through, you would have been alive but not necessarily working in this field. And I think what you see here is fairly self-evident. What we got in response to the death of Victoria Climbier was a very knee-jerk, bureaucratic, prescriptive, constraining response to how we understood social work. And so we got the introduction of the integrated children's system and all the new initiatives that came from that about teams around the child and professionals trying to work more closely together. We got the common assessment framework with, again, attempts to systematise and be more systematic about how we gathered information. Along with the integrated children's services was the integrated children's system, where we've got all the IT provision to record documentation. This is all very familiar, I know to you, but all of it was underpinned by this strive to try and eliminate risk by bringing in more and more managerial, procedural, prescriptive approaches to practice. So your time became more focused on putting things into the computer than being out with people. This is a common kind of, 80% of your time is in front of the computer, somebody's nodding here, yeah. And you're more likely probably to get repetitive strain injury than perhaps be attacked by a service user. That's an unfortunate example to give, but there is that kind of sense in it. And I think this, although this refers to the childcare domain, I think people in adult services would say very similar experiences have happened there. There has been this bureaucratisation of practice. And I like this term that Sue Peckover and colleagues termed the electronic child. This sense that children were no longer people in their own right, but really were what they were on a piece of paper. They'd become data that was inputted into a wider system. So that was the first era that went on essentially for 7 years, up until we had the tragic death of baby Peter Connolly. This then, in effect, triggered, in many ways, more responses of the same vein. So we have the post-baby Peter Social Work Task Force and Reform Board era. So in the first instance, in the childcare domain, we had Lord Laming's progress report on how things were going, and in a sense, an attempt to bring in more bureaucratic measures to try and manage the risk that people were so concerned about. But I think there was a fortunate conflation of events too, with the findings of research that were being done by colleagues across the country in relation to some of the earlier initiatives, into the integrated children's system, into the common assessment framework. So the work of people like Karen Broadhurst, Sue White, Andrew Pitthouse, into how effective these systems were and how they were being implemented, actually came out at the same time that the death of Peter Connolly hit the public domain. And this, I think, was really significant because actually what these research findings were telling us was precisely this development of the electronic child, the depersonalisation of practice, the removal really of relationships from practice. So people became numbers and data rather than individuals with their own experience. So whilst it was just synchronicity that these things happened, it's been very pertinent, I think, in relation then to what the Social Work Task Force and Reform Board were able to do in response to the government's outcry, really, about the state of social work and what needed to happen. There was some good, hard evidence to say that despite the well-intentioned initiatives that were introduced, the integrated children's system and all the Every Child Matters agenda, there had been unintentional, as Munro refers to them, unintentional adverse consequences. And these were what were resulting in this sense of social work losing its relationship base. And those research documents, those papers that are in the British Journal of Social Work and Child and Family Social Work, if you haven't read them, I'd really encourage you to read them because they're really pivotal, I think, to understanding what has happened over the past 10 years and what we're needing to redress in order to re-establish a relationship base in the practice that we are engaged in. So I think it's the task force and the reform board that have really had this challenge of trying to re-professionalise the workforce. But as we're all well aware, it's not something that happens overnight. And I think one of the strong features of the reform board, for which we owe Moira Gibb a debt of gratitude for steering it in the way that she has, is that they set out a reform process that is over a considerable period of time. They haven't gone for quick fix responses, but they've tried to see something in a comprehensive and longitudinal way to try and see if we can really embed some of the changes into the system rather than just have short, sharp responses that will be gone within a year. So that's the second phase that I think we've been in. And I think this is where we are now, 2012, which we'd actually probably say now and beyond, as we've changed, the year has changed. We're in the post-Munro and the reclaiming social work era. Now I've fallen foul of my own, I don't know the word, things I don't like, that's not very good words, but I struggle with these reports and activities that get labelled by somebody's name, because I'm not sure that it's helpful for the individual whose name is attached to it, and for us, putting all the responsibility or expectation on an individual who has written it. So I think that's an interesting thing to struggle with. Why do we now get into this notion of the Monroe report, the post-Monroe era? I'm not sure it's entirely helpful. But I think that is where we are, and we're also in this era of reclaiming social work, which many of you may know the Hackney model. Yes, nods around the room. Which is what it is. It is the Hackney model of trying to restructure social work in a way that has the relationship at the core. And if people want to know more about it, I'm happy to talk over lunch. There are other people in the room who know about it. But it is, in a sense, something that has taken hold within Hackney quite effectively in the past few years, and being adopted by different authorities around the country. But I think also there has to be a word of caution there, because no one model fits all. It will not be a panacea for all the problems. So again, I'm falling foul of by suggesting that is also the way we should go, because I don't think it is entirely. But there are certainly some very good elements of the thinking that come from the reclaiming social work agenda. And within this, I think you can then see the key things here, I think, are the fact that within the Monroe report, there's a real sense, along with the Reform Board, that this blame and scapegoating culture needs to be tackled head on, because it's become so pervasive and so constraining of our practice. People are so fearful of the consequences of their actions. It inhibits what we're prepared to do, and we become risk averse rather than risk tolerant or managing of risk. And I think some of the systemic approaches that are embedded within the Monroe Review will go some way to beginning to tackle some of that, as we see the failures that happen as systemic failures rather than attributable to one individual. Because when it feels like the world's on your shoulders, there's no doubt you can't practice as freely and as confidently and as competently as you are no doubt able to do. So I think that's really significant, that shift to looking at things organisationally rather than necessarily individually. There's been a recognition that the centralisation of practice and the standardisation of practice in things like the integrated children's system has actually prevented creativity at the local level. So there is a shift to people within their own local areas being able to develop their own systems within parameters, but allows people to respond more accurately to the areas that they're working in. I mean, an example of this would be that Cambridge is adopting the reclaiming social work model, as I understand it, wholesale, rather than thinking about what works here and what isn't needed. So in a sense, they have fallen foul, and they've thought of something as being a panacea. We'll introduce it, we'll take it on board, hook, line and sinker, without realising that their context, Cambridgeshire, is not the same as Hackney. So things need to be adjusted to fit the areas that you work in. And I think the third element of this era that we're in is a recognition that social workers need to be engaging with what gets talked about quite often as the practical, moral, relationship-based dimensions of social work, not just the technical, rational, bureaucratic dimensions. The danger being that you mustn't throw one out with the other. We have veered too far over to social workers being techno-bureaucrats. In responding and taking up the invitation that Andrew has set in his opening paper to us, to become more relationship-based, to understand the use of self in practice, we can't afford to throw out the procedures and everything that goes with that model altogether. It's about some sort of integration. That's what we're looking for. So this, I think, is where we're currently sitting, in this landscape of change, where things are going to become more organisationally inclusive, more localised in terms of service provision, and the way we understand our practice has the potential to change to something more relationship-based. And this is how Monroe captures it, this notion of the relational term. The professional account of social work practice, in which relationships play a central role, appears to have been gradually stifled and replaced by a managerialist account that is fundamentally different. The managerialist approach has been called the rational technical approach, where the emphasis has been on the conscious cognitive elements of the task of working with children and families, on collecting information and making plans. this focus has led to a curious absence from a great deal of social work and child protection literature, policy and discussions about practice, of any considered attention to the core dynamics, experience and methods of doing the work. And I think it's that core dynamics and experience that is what we're interested in today. So that there is this sense that Munro is inviting us to look at that and think how we can recover it. But where are we actually now? Because colleagues recently who were talking at a large Basel Health event, some of you may have been there in London, and we're talking about this potentially exciting place where we are. I'd refer to it, we're on a cusp, I think we're on a cusp of something new developing. And these two social work academics were presenting their understanding of where things were at. And somebody who was there spoke to me afterwards. I wasn't at the event, but they said they were aware, sitting in the audience, that it felt like the majority of the audience were rather like rabbits in headlights. There were the academics saying there is a potential for change, we're in a new place. But in fact the audience weren't in a position to hear that. And that may resonate with you, or you may think that's not where you are. That might be an interesting point for discussion through the day. But this individual's sense of the reception of what the academics were saying to the audience was not that well received, because it felt too difficult to think about what going into a relationship-based world might look like. So it echoes some of what Andrew has been saying about ambivalence. I think there is genuine ambivalence within the social work workforce about how we can begin to engage with relationships, particularly when we might not feel we have the support structures to support us doing it in that way. And I think that's pivotal to our confidence about being able to do it, that we can feel we have the organisational support to back us. And when we're not reliant so heavily on the procedural defences that have become embedded in practice, it can leave us feeling quite exposed. And I think what I'm saying we need to be thinking about is, in psychoanalytic terms, finding a depressive position, which isn't that we all go around like this, but that we try and find a position that is integrated. Depressive positions are about integrating, in a sense, the good and the bad. So integrating the managerial bits of practice that are good with the relationship-based bits of practice that are good. But we can't go around being unaccountable. We need good systems. But the systems shouldn't drive practice. The relationships should drive the systems that support practice. And I think that's where things have gone a bit awry in recent years. But if we think about the notion of rabbits and headlights and try and think about, well, what then, if we are at this point of a potential relational turn in practice, what are the obstacles that are getting in the way? And my experience from talking with practitioners, conducting research, being aware of the current kind of atmosphere around, is that there is a great sense of practitioners, and by that I also mean managers, feeling quite impoverished and quite malnourished. That there are people out there who have trained and gone into practice who won't have had experience of previous eras in the profession where supervision did concentrate on the experience of working with a service user and helped you think what that experience was like for you. So there are people who've only ever known supervision, which is really a management workload tool. And there are managers out there, I think, who've been managing for a long time under very difficult circumstances, and increasingly difficult circumstances, who themselves have never had good training to be managers, who have had to learn it on the job, and who themselves have never experienced good work-based supervision as a manager. There's some idea that once you're a manager, you don't have feelings, you don't need to talk about your work, you just manage budgets and procedures. So something kind of inhumane, to my mind, seems to get into the system once you hit the manager level. And it's not how managers want to be, but it's what the system can force them into, and not provide them with the necessary resources to retain a relationship-based approach to managing staff. And I think these things have to trickle down through the organisation, the staff to be able to then be relationship-based in their approach to service users. So we've got this workforce that is probably feeling quite ill-equipped in many ways to take on this invitation to become relationship-based. And just a couple of examples of this. Somebody was talking about their research in another conference and said that they were doing ethnographic research in a childcare team, and they observed that it took a team manager an hour to get from one side of the room out the door to the toilet, because the journey across the room involved her in being stopped at various intervals by practitioners to ask questions about various things. I'm sure any managers in the room will recognise that sense of people needing responses immediately, having difficulty in a sense holding on to feelings, anxieties about their work they're doing, so that there's a constant sense of bombardment rather than, using the term that Andrew introduced, as containment, things being managed and contained until a supervision session, until a team meeting. And also, a colleague told me about going into an area office when she'd gone to visit a colleague in relation to a meeting, going into the loos there and discovering two women in there crying. And she was just doing a business, going to the loo and whatnot. And she was aware, in the context of the conversation that they were having, that it was work-related tears that they were experiencing. It wasn't that something necessarily personal happened. It was work-related stress that was being expressed in the loo. And I think that's not insignificant. I mean, what happens in places like loos that perhaps when you're working in an open plan office, it's the most private space you can have, is not to be underestimated. And I think that's a very poignant image to retain. So there's that sense of toilets and not being able to get to the loo or needing to be in the loo to feel safe. And there's this kind of pernicious climate of tick boxes being everywhere, that you've just constantly got to be filling things in. You don't have any headspace for anything else, because you don't feel the factors on your screen, and you know that you'll be under pressure from your manager, or your manager will be under pressure from their manager to get something completed. And I think the third obstacle is in relation to what I was talking about this climate we're in, where actually to express professional vulnerability and sensitivity is seen as a weakness. That the fear is that if we say we're frightened of doing something, we're not even frightened, we just don't think we've got the wherewithal to do it, or we just need some help thinking about how to do it, isn't regarded as a competence. And I want to suggest paradoxically that actually professional competence is about professional vulnerability and sensitivity. Because I think unless we claim those professional qualities, we fall into the trap of claiming omnipotence, that we can do everything, that we're all powerful, and we won't be able to engage with the sensitivity we need to in relation to the families that we're working with. So our practice is going to become more disconnected from those families than connected, and our decisions will be less well informed as a result of that. And this extract is taken from some research I've been doing with childcare practitioners, and it was asking them, they were invited to come to reflective case discussion meetings. The focus of the research would be around the issues they had talking with children, communicating with children. And it was as broad as they could bring a case and talk about it and have discussion with colleagues. And this was one particular worker in relation to thinking about removing children from their family. But we've got to show the children that actually we're in control here, we're quite strong. I can't really show you that I'm upset, that I'm angry at your mum, or that you know when you break down, actually I'm trying to hold back the tears and take a long swallow, because actually I'm feeling that pain that you're feeling, but you kind of, it's almost in a way you kind of feel like I'm failing if I do that. Do you know what I mean? It's about getting in there, telling them what the situation is, and getting out as quickly as you can. And how will you deal with that in your car? Because, you know, I've often gone back and had a little cry in my car, and I just think, how are those kids feeling? I mean, it's all in one breath, really. And the car is like the toilet, I think. The car is one of our sort of safe places, where a lot of the feelings that we have get in some way acknowledged, but then we've had to go into the office not disclosing that level of distress. And I think this practitioner was speaking last year, but it equally could have been what Olive Stevenson said in her comment about needing to be in touch with our feelings. And if we're not in touch with our feelings, as Leon says, we can't think well. The two have to go together. So how do we try and make sense of this. We've got the possibilities of moving into some sort of new era, not entirely new, but with new possibilities. We've also got some obstacles that are going to get in the way potentially. And how do we understand those enough to prevent them stopping us taking advantage of the opportunities we've got? And I think we have to think about it in terms of anxiety. That if we think about all the behaviours that stop us taking advantage of opportunities, of engaging in change, it's invariably anxiety that underpins them. So if we can think about what anxiety might do to us, then we might be able to open up our responses to deal with it. And I think echoing Monroe's shift towards more organisational understandings of failures in professional practice, we need to think about this notion of anxiety as not just being our own anxiety as individuals, but something that organisations experience and then defend themselves against. And there's a whole literature here around social defences that get into institutional behaviours. So it's not just that we might feel inadequate, in fact we need to see that organisations can be inadequate and can fail us in terms of what we need to do the work. And then both the individual and the organisation need to think about how anxiety can be contained. Because picking up again on what Andrew said, it's only if we can think the unthinkable and see the unseeable that we can do effective practice. And to do that, we need places where we can take those unthinkable thoughts and those unseeable pictures and talk with somebody about them, rather than pretend they're not going on and make decisions that actually don't take those feelings into account. So there's a real need, I think, for organisations to look in response to the requirements of the Reform Board about how they are supporting practitioners and, as importantly, how they're supporting managers in doing this work. I think, too, that as practitioners we need to be struggling to understand what we mean by confrontational empathy. We have to continue to exhibit empathic responses to the people we work with who are in situations of vulnerability and distress. But we can't do that at the expense of simply becoming a friend to them, developing a relationship that doesn't have confrontational elements. So again, there's a paradox in there somewhere about being confrontational in empathic ways, which I think is also reflected in Harry Ferguson's idea of good authority. We mustn't shirk our authority, but we can develop skills to exercise it in good ways. And what I think this means is that there needs to be a shift, not just in terms of new procedures, new organisational structures. There needs to be a cultural shift in how we think about ourselves as individual professionals, how we think about ourselves as professionals within a wider professional body, and how we think about ourselves within organisational contexts. That we need to make demands on our organisations for what we need in order to do the job properly. So it's not just about changes on the surface, it's changes underneath that need to happen. And this, I just think, is a lovely way of thinking of containment. It's a beautiful image. I mean, containment, when it was first thought about by Bion, was around the mother-infant or the carer-infant relationship. And seeing that capacity for a mother to recognise distressing feelings in an infant and be able to respond to them. And that's actually what we're saying. We have distressing feelings that arise in relation to our work. And we need structures and systems that can contain them, but a cultural context that recognises that is what goes on. That's how practice affects us. And finally, this is perhaps one way we can try and get our organisations to do it. This is a wish list. I don't know if anybody's come across these, but these, I hope the slide will full justice to them. These are called contemplation pods. Somebody heard of them? Yes, one person, yeah. They're part of the Scottish Parliament building. And when the Scottish Parliament building was built, all of these contemplation pods were built on the sort of side of the offices of the Scottish MPs. So I don't know what they're actually like inside, whether they're like a little recess or whether they're actually a little room off a room. But there was recognition that those people needed a kind of still, quiet, contemplative space where they could effectively do their work. And if you go into the Scottish Parliament building, it's a fantastic building. And the other feature that I learned about recently when I was there is that there are no solid doors. That they wanted there to be transparency within that building, so that nothing, in a sense, went on behind closed doors. Now that's probably a bit ambitious, because if it doesn't go on behind that door, it'll go on somewhere else. That's human nature. But there were some principles embedded into that building about how they wanted to respect people. And whilst I don't expect you to all be able to go back to your organisations and say, we want contemplation pods, when do we want them now? It's some image of what we should expect and what we need in order to do the work that we're required to do